All right. In the news again, we're hearing about tariffs and duties. And one of the big debates that's come out of the last couple of weeks is who actually pays these tariffs. I don't know why there's confusion on this, so we are gonna try and put that to bed today. Let's get into it.
Return to the Mac. Get on what it is, what it does, what it is, what it isn't. Looking for a better way to get up out of bed instead of getting on the internet and checking a new hit. Get up. First shot, come strut walking. A little bit of humble, a little bit of cautious. Somewhere between like Rocky and Cosby's for the game. Nope.
When it comes to tariffs, they are assessed in the form of duties or taxes, depending on what country you're importing into. We're gonna stay on target for the US today. So we're gonna talk about duties, which is the byproduct of tariffs. When a tariff is assessed on a commodity, the importer has to pay a duty. That duty goes to the federal government. Instead of trying to use my own words to articulate and create this to be somewhat argumentative, I am going to read you directly from the Code of Federal Regulations, which is a government website that is used for all importers and exporters to understand the law around trade. I'm going to read you verbatim what it says. The first thing that I want to say before I get into that is it will use the word importer. If you're not familiar with what that means, the importer is the person responsible for bringing the product into their location. If you buy something from a foreign country and you paid for it, more than likely you will be the importer, which means you would be liable to what I'm about to read. So in the Code of Federal Regulations, Title 9, Chapter 1, Part 141, Subpart A, 141.1, liability of importer for duties. The time duties accrue are based upon when the imported merchandise arrives at the customs port of entry with the intent of use within the United States. The customs port of entry would typically be something like a major airport, Chicago, LAX, Kennedy, you name it, or an ocean port like Los Angeles, Long Beach, Baltimore, things like that. So that's when the duties are assessed for the most part. There is nuance to that if you operate in a foreign trade zone or you're doing import to export without intent to use in this country, then these laws will absolutely change. But for the most part, the importer starts to accrue duty liability when the merchandise or the goods arrives at an approved customs port of entry, airport, or a major ocean port. Here's the part that hopefully puts a lot of this debate to bed. Payment of duties. Payment of duties is the personal debt of the importer. We're going to go into that in a little bit more. The liability for duties, both regular and additional, constitutes a personal debt from the importer to the United States, which can be discharged only by payment in full of all duties legally accruing unless relieved by law or regulation. Payment to a broker covering duties does not relieve the importer of the liability. What that means is most people who import goods, they don't pay the government directly. They will pay a broker, a third-party agency, like a UPS or a DHL or a FedEx, to process that import clearance and payment to the federal government. So paying them doesn't mean you're absolved of your debt or that you are not still liable for it if you decide to do that. That's all that they're talking about there, is if you use a broker and the broker doesn't pay, you're not off the hook, still your problem. From there, it goes on, as you can imagine, because it's a legal government document for hundreds and hundreds of pages. Basically, from there, it goes on to say that if duties are not paid, it is enforceable by the United States government. And what they will typically do is determine if it was out of negligence or incompetence. And if that's the case, they will give you an opportunity to make restitution with a ridiculous fine and probably more scrutiny on future imports. Or if it's a massive or repetitive violation, they will just refuse your rights to import into this country anymore. So I want you to think about that for a second. If the importer of goods does not pay the US government the duties or taxes that they are owed, and they continually violate that, the government will just say, you are no longer allowed to participate in importation into this country. Think of how devastating that would be to a lot of organizations. But I digress. That's not what we're here to talk about. The main thing that we need to know and that everyone needs to realize is that tariffs are assessed in the form of duties, and those duties are most commonly borne by the importer of record. The importer being the individual or the organization that procured those goods and brought them into the United States. This again is coming from the Code of Federal Regulations on the .gov website, where all brokers, customs agents, and other authorities will rely upon to decide how they need to navigate working with Homeland Security or Customs Border Protection. So again, duties are the responsibility of the importer. They are not paid by the consumer. They are not paid by the exporter being a country or being an agency. They are paid by the importer the majority of the time. Now, a couple times in that I mentioned they're paid by the importer most of the time. So we're going to talk a little bit about that nuance. This isn't going to be a lesson in trade. It's more about how it's determined who pays for the duties. And even with what I'm about to tell you, at the end of the day, the answer will always be the same, that the country that exports the product is typically not going to be liable for the duties. It would be the organization at best. With that being said, determination of who pays these tariffs or these duties are usually based on what are referred to as Incoterms. Incoterms stand for International Commercial Terms. They are typically 11 predefined terms. They are typically set by the International Chamber of Commerce. So countries who participate in free trade have all elected upon these approved Incoterms, which basically take the three primary types of liability in a shipment or in an import and say who is responsible. As an example of what those three different liabilities are, there's the cost for the shipment, there is the responsibility of the duties and taxes, and then there's typically insurance. The Incoterms decide who's responsible for those three. In the United States, the three most common Incoterms have the responsibility of duty payments coming from the importer. And I'm not going to go through what those three are because it really doesn't have any bearing on this conversation. The main thing that you need to know, and you can check this out online, is that the United States primary imports under three Incoterms. Those three Incoterms, if you want to go check it out, are FOB, FCA, and Ex-Works. All put liability of duties on the importer of record. That represents 70 to 80% of all US imports. Based on if you're assessing that percentage on value of goods or volume of imports, it can move. On average, that's the range that you're going to see those being used. Outside of those three primary used, there is another one which comes in as number 4. That one is DDP, and we're going to talk about that one because it means deliver duty paid. That is an Incoterm that would determine that whoever sold the goods, a vendor in China, exports to a company in the US, and they use an Incoterm of DDP, only at that moment and only in that scenario does it mean that China or the exporting vendor in China is responsible to pay the duties. So we're going to back up on that to reiterate it. Duties are the responsibility of the importer of record the majority of the time. In the US, The top three Incoterms, which are the international commercial terms set by the International Chamber of Commerce, are importer of record duty liabilities. The fourth after that, which is delivered duty paid or DDP, would be the responsibility of the exporting organization. The reason you need to know that is because in the news, all we're hearing about is that there is a debate on who is responsible for duties and taxes. And it's not a debate. You can go to the Code of Federal Regulations and you can look up who is liable for duties. And it'll tell you exactly what I just read. It's a federal document that's used by legal agencies, customs brokers, and anyone else who is in that field. What that means is that you and I, or the companies that we work for, or the companies that are based in the United States, when tariffs are assessed, they pay the duty. And we've talked about it before. Whether they decide to eat the expense and erode margin or pass it on to the customers in the form of a price increase, completely different topic, but that's exactly what will happen. In the instances where it is being borne by the exporter because it's shipping DDP or similar, what is happening in those scenarios is that the purchase price for those goods is increasing. So it's not putting the duties onto the burden of the organization in the exporting country because they're just issuing a price increase to the destination or their customer. At that point, the customer has to make a decision. Do I stay with this vendor? Is it still fiscally viable for me to continue to do business in this trade lane? Or do I need to go somewhere else? But again, we talked about that. That is a long runway. A lot of complexity goes into it. Right now, everything is just wait and see, status quo. Duties are paid by the importer for almost all US imports. Now I want to get a little bit practical and talk about why global trade is needed and why tariffs are not necessarily going to drive the desired outcome or the means to the end. Every country on this planet is dependent on goods or services from other countries. And I'm not going to get into the economic or political aspects of that. I'm going to get into something that's very practical that hopefully everybody can understand. Not all raw goods or raw minerals are available everywhere. You've heard in the news the last couple of days that the conversations that we're having with China are around those types of exotic materials or raw minerals that are only available in certain regions that the US has a dependency on. If we were to do something drastic and increase a massive tariff on those types of goods to the point where we stopped buying them, there will be challenges. I'm going to go through an example of that so that it's very clear on what this means. One of the more common raw minerals that are mined and produced is natural graphite. Right now, the United States depends 100% on imports of natural graphite, primarily coming from China. Natural graphite, you don't need to know what it is or what it's used for because I'm going to give you a couple examples so you can see the magnitude of what it has. The main two applications that graphite is going to go into are lithium-ion batteries and lubricants. Think of everything in your house or everything that you interact with that uses one of those two things. That list is going to be massive. If we tariffed natural graphite to the point where it was no longer importable, we would not be able to service that out of our own soil because it doesn't exist. More accurately, it doesn't exist at scale. And if we did have to do that, the price would be absolutely unfathomable. And I'm not going to leave that on a cliffhanger. I'm going to give you a real example on what it would cost to move production of a raw mineral from one location to another, just to put it into context on what it would do to your pocket. So natural graphite, 100% dependency for the US on import from other countries. And that is lithium-ion batteries, lubricants, and a slew of other things. We tariff that out, that stops. We have no contingency. Another example of 100% dependency is gallium. Gallium is used in semiconductors, in LEDs, basically any light that you have in a modern vehicle or even LED light bulbs. All of that requires gallium, which is mined in China, along with a couple of other places that the US is 100% dependent on. It is also used in power electronics. And basically what that means is if it's an electronic component that is responsible for delivering or distributing power or energy, you will find gallium in that component. And again, now you're talking about things like laptops, smartphones, television, radios, things like that that take an electrical current in and have to distribute it. We're dependent on that mineral to do that. And again, the US, 100% dependency on it. So we cannot just cut trade off and be a self-sustaining country because there's things that just don't exist in our soil. So we would have to find a way to offset that or change materials or invent new processes to eliminate dependency on those. Absolutely can happen, right? But it's not going to happen quickly, and it's not going to happen because we just issued tariffs on some of these commodities because we don't like the position that we're in. So that's two real examples. And there is a list of over 14 minerals that the US has 100% dependency on. They're either not available in our land or there is not enough of it in our land to produce the demand or to satisfy the demand that we have. All right, you're gonna have to get a little nerdy with me on this because this is where I get excited just because I like doing this kind of research and it plays into my career background quite a bit. But hopefully it's educational and it helps give you guys a little bit of contextual understanding on what would happen if we moved some of these raw minerals or requirements into our country. And I'm gonna choose copper because it's something we are all familiar with. It's available in our soil. It's available in a lot of places around the world. And it is used in everything, right? So right now, if you look at copper, we're gonna look at this as a cost per pound basis. Right now, if you take all of the imported copper that we bring in, excluding what is produced in the United States, on average, you're gonna see around 80 cents per pound, right? That can go up to about $1 with some different things based on what commodities are trading at. But for the most part, over time, we're seeing around 80 cents per pound. To reproduce that exact same pound in the United States costs $3. Basically what that means is if all copper production moved into the US, anything that you buy that has copper in it will have a price increase of 300% or 3x. Obviously not the entire value of the good because it's not 100% copper, but the cost of copper in every application, if made in the US and used in the US, will increase 3x. That might not sound like a lot, but this is where it actually gets kind of cool and kind of interesting. In countries like Peru or Chile, they look at this or they measure it in a kiloton per annum or kiloton per year metric. For them to be able to mine the copper, this doesn't include the cost of labor and all that kind of stuff, but just the capital investment, the upfront cost to start this operation in those two lower cost regions, on average, is between $5 to $10 billion. $5 to $10 billion in capital investment in Peru and Chile to produce, on average, 300 kilotons per year of copper. The rate that I gave earlier of $3 per pound in the US is not as high as some people might think it would be because that is heavily dependent. The US mines, as you can imagine, operates on a high degree of sophisticated excavation and automation. So for the US to mine the same product, the only reason the cost is semi-affordable is because we use a lot of technology and equipment to replace people, which by all means is great. We all know that mining industry is questionable in other regions It needs to get addressed. With labor laws in the US and things like that, obviously, we cannot have the same working conditions that other countries may allow for mining. Not going to get into that, but just putting it into context that the $3 per pound for copper compared to 80 cents coming out of Chile and Peru is only semi-affordable or competitive because the US makes a much larger capital investment to use technology, automation, and things like that. So I wanted to put that in context because here's the kicker. For the US to produce the same 300 kilotons per year of copper would take $50 billion of capital investment. I want to say that again. For the US to produce 300 kilotons of copper on an annual basis would take closer to a 10x capital investment of around $50 billion. We can't use our labor. We would need to have all of the infrastructure enabled to do that. And I'm not talking about basic civic infrastructure like road and rail and things like that. I'm talking about all of the other investment that would need to go into machinery and technology so that we can continue to do this at a much larger scale than we do today. So in addition to the $3 per pound of copper, we would have around a $50 billion cash outlay to stand up an operation to be able to get to that level of scale. If you put that $50 billion investment into the cost of goods, that $3, all of a sudden it's unaffordable. You're talking about 100x as opposed to a 2x multiplier for the cost of copper per pound. I do want to mention on that $50 billion investment, if you amortize that over 10 years based on the 300 kiloton per annum expectation, then it would only increase the cost of copper about 10x. You'd be adding around $8 per pound to the $3 that we already discussed. So up front on year one, if we had to absorb it, no one would be able to afford it. Unless they amortize that outlay over a period of 10 years and preferably greater, minimally, it would be a 10x increase into the price of copper. There's a couple of things that I'm hoping we can put to bed after this conversation. The first is that duties are paid in majority by the importer. The liability is set in the Incoterms. The Incoterms apply to every transaction or every import that comes into this country, but it is the importer of record who pays those duties to the US government through a broker, direct, whatever. The importer is liable for the majority of it. Secondarily, there are raw minerals or materials like graphite or gallium that are just not available at scale in our soil. So we are import dependent. No way around it. I do want to say that other countries are also dependent on us. I mean, we look at agriculture. There's countries that cannot produce agriculture to sustain their own cities and towns. So they are dependent on countries like the US that are obviously very lush and rich and have a green environment, and farming is a big part of our society. So it's not just one way. The point is every country depends on trade to survive. No country can operate in a silo. And lastly, if we did decide to produce things like copper 100% in our own country, at best, you would see a 2x increase on everything that material goes into, using the copper example. Knowing what the capital investment would be in the tens of billions of dollars just to be able to become operational, it would get to the point where things that we take for granted today, like a cell phone, would go up in price 5 or 6x. Your $1,000 phone would become $4,000 or $5,000 because you're paying US labor for US goods with heavy capital investment. And it's great, it's made here. And if that's the right thing to do or if not, is not what we're here to talk about. But these things that are being decided and these decisions that are being made, you need to be aware of the consequences or the causality that they have when they're committed to. Because right now, a lot of people are hearing these things and saying, yeah, it's great. China's going to get assessed all these tariffs. we're going to go do something else and we're going to be fine. I really wish that was the case because it was that easy. It's just not. It's just not. We are dependent on global trade. Every country is dependent on global trade. And when one country starts to take heavy actions against it because they think they're being treated unfairly, that is concerning. It seems to be a little bit more limited in scope than what the actual development would turn into if these things were sustained for a longer period of time. We're dependent on it. Canada's dependent on it, China's dependent on it, Europe, South America, you name it, every country is dependent on trade. No country can operate in a silo. No country can produce everything they need to sustain their society. It's just the way that it works. Free trade was invented so that all countries could share with each other without having to worry about things like this. Hopefully you now have a little bit more clarity, and hopefully we can stop having the debate on who's responsible for duties. It is the importer of record. That's what's on the government website. Until that changes, every law agency, customs broker, and customs agent is going to operate under those directives. If you have questions, let me know. I appreciate it as always. Until next time, later.
Spread it across the country. Labels out here, now they can't tell me nothing. We give it to the people. Spread it across the country.
Here we go back. This is the moment. Tonight is the night. We'll fight till it's over.
These things are supposed to calm me down.
Hands up like the ceiling.